Hello. Today I'm going to give my thoughts on love, which is actually a very big topic, but I'm going to break it down and I'm going to focus mostly on the kind of Greek categories of love. But if you like anything you see here, you can hit the like button or subscribe or hit the bell for notifications, any of that stuff. But let's start. First, I think the thing that we got to get into is philia, which means friendship or affection. I think every person has those things. Now, it depends on what they're directed toward, and not just that, but how you project it or convey it, I guess. But the opposite of philia would be phobia, and that's kind of a fear of. I think when you're talking about love, you're talking about kind of a surrendering to it or bringing it in, whereas in phobia, you're trying to push it away. So the very basic love, I think, would be kind of love of thy neighbor, which I think is often very difficult to do. It seems like it might be the easiest, but I think it's actually quite hard to do. Partly because you don't really know your neighbors that well, but also because there are lots of different kinds of people in the world, and even though they live near you, doesn't mean they're like you. I think that's one beauty of the internet, is that the internet has helped tribes around the world kind of get together. When before the internet, that was much harder to do, and you were kind of stuck in your place with either people you liked or didn't like, and you had to kind of deal with it. Now, I think it's much easier to kind of mix with different people around the world and different ideas and, all that stuff. So in that way, I think the internet is great. But we're going to start out mostly with eros, which is where the word erotic comes from. And that, I think, is maybe the most elemental kind of love, the most tied to the physical being. And it kind of translates as love or desire. But I think it actually goes beyond that. There are lots of kinds of romantic love, and eros is just one type of those things. I like to think of it more as like the madness of the gods. So I have a video on the mythological sort of aspects of the deities. You can check that out if you want. But I talk a bit about that in that video, about how the deities sort of breathe things into you. And in this case, when something is erotic, it's almost an irrational feeling that overcomes you for certain things. And that's kind of where you get into like fetishes, where people have these kind of irrational desires towards like shoes or different things. Much of that is psychological, based upon their childhood and whatever, but there's also an unknown element that I think happens at times when people are kind of turned on by things that they don't expect. And that could be if you believe in the deity kind of idea, or the thought form coming into you and sort of taking over a little bit. And I think, the erotic is more of a passion. And, it's been represented in art many times with Eros or Cupid and the arrows. But another part of it is like infatuation, where someone gets fixated on their love object or love individual. And, that could even lean a little bit into a kind of illness, psychological illness. And neurosis, I guess. But you have, that's one thing it's one thing I know from writing erotica, is that there are so many different kinds of infatuations, sexual infatuations, And in the erotic world, it becomes these different categories, but I think, some of that can't really be distilled into a category. It's elusive, and I think it destroys people often. It can. So, yeah, I mean, it's an uncontrollable urge often, and you definitely feel it when you're in lust with someone. Like if you meet someone and you feel this sort of sexual lust, you're feeling eros. It's also part of limerence, I think, if you know what limerence is. Limerence is the kind of state that a person goes into when they have a crush on someone. Now, that person could reciprocate the feelings, but often that actually doesn't matter. The limerence, the love, is kind of one-sided. And maybe even sometimes the object of their affection doesn't even know that they feel that way on one hand, but also if they did, they would not want that. So limerent feelings can often lead to like obsession or like a focus on the ideal of the person and not necessarily the actual person. And I think everybody to some degree has limerent feelings. Some people focus completely on them and the person doesn't even matter. It's the ideal. But often when you fall in love with someone, the first few months are kind of like limerent because you have this idea of the person, and as you chip away at the person, you start to realize that your idea might not have been accurate or partially accurate, maybe. Now, there could be some person that falls in love with someone and they actually recognize that person 100% from the beginning, but I find that very improbable. I think everyone is a deep well of mystery, and that's part of the process of falling in love, is uncovering the layers, kind of, for good or for bad. Another form of love, I think I'm pronouncing this correctly, it's storge. Maybe it's wrong. You can correct me in the comments if you think I'm pronouncing it wrong. But it means instinctual love, and that would be like love of parent and child, or maybe even to some degree teacher and student. Even some marriages are a type of this kind of love, or where people will sacrifice their actual romantic love feelings and put the family or the home first. And you see this a lot when actually you see it a lot in nature when animals protect their young. They're willing to die for their young, and they're willing to do very insane things to protect them. When you hear the stories about a mom picking up a car or something, that would be an extreme form of this, I guess. But I think that kind of love everybody feels to some degree. I mean, you probably even feel it for your brothers and sisters. It's that kind of love where you don't necessarily maybe like the person, but you love the person because they're your family member. Often, parents will say, yeah, I love my child, but I don't like my child. And I think that's actually quite common. Parents and children can be very different because of their generational differences, and often one child will take on more attributes of one or the other parent, and then often if things don't go well with the marriage, maybe they see too much of the other person in the child, so then there's a lot of complications within that. But the next one is agape, which means selfless, sort of God's love, charity, self-sacrifice, this kind of holy love. And I think this is probably one of the more difficult ones to wrap your head around, and maybe the fewest amount of people actually embrace this kind of love. Partly because I think it's the hardest one. And the reason why I think this is so difficult is because it's a higher love that kind of goes beyond physical desires. And the reason that erotic love is most common is because I think most people live only inside their bodies. They very rarely think of higher ideals. And, you know, I don't think enough people meditate and pray and do things that get them in touch with this style of love. But, you know, there are different ways to do this. You can do charity work, things where you are giving yourself selflessly. And, you know, obviously, if you're thinking of like Jesus's kind of love, that would be a type of sacrifice. But I think it goes beyond just that. I think that there is a desire in this. There's a desire to know that this world is flawed, and that, you know, to get to the perfect world, or they might call it the heavenly world. I prefer not to actually look at it that way, but to get to the eternal world, I think that's a better way to put it. There are certain things you kind of have to do, I think. You have to, part of our lives are chipping away at the blocks that keep us from that. And I think that if you can get rid of some of those blocks, the light kind of comes in. And you can usually tell when you meet a person whether they've done any work in this way or not. In many ways, they seem both darker and light at the same time. They have kind of a darkness and a brightness. And you can see this if you see like a priest. Maybe that's the wrong way to put it. Maybe it's not a darkness and a light. It's more of a weight. People that don't really explore these things, they often seem a little kind of empty or light in comparison to that. But I think, you know, when we're younger, when we're a child, we're very close to it, I think. But then as we get older, we get further away and we fall more into the erotic love. Or maybe love of friends. But as you get older and your mortality is challenged, I think that you become, or not everybody, but many people become more aware of this kind of love, and that they're searching for it, partly because they're worried about what's going to happen when they die. But also, it's also because of difference between innocence and experience. And I think the more experience you have in the world, the more you can maybe touch this holy light, let's say. Partly just because you're not contained in your innocence, you're not contained in your ignorance. And you can kind of branch out into other places and have other challenges and defeats, struggles, ordeals. All these things can awaken this kind of love more, I think. I think maybe it becomes a bit of a burden as well, especially if you have that in you and other people do not have it. They don't know what it is and they can't identify it. So, you see this a lot in many stories, biblical parables and stuff, like people getting stoned, or Shirley Jackson's The Lottery, I think, is kind of an example of it. How the group can turn on the individual. And if you have a high amount of this kind of spiritual light, I think you can draw people to you and also repel people and challenge people in a way that they don't like. And when people get afraid, just like an animal, they will tend to lash out. So I think if they are afraid of their own divinity within them, that can be a big problem with this. But I would also say that the erotic world, the erotic love, bleeds into the higher love, or the holy love. And that might be blasphemous to say, or a contradiction, some might think. But I think that those two things are they're very similar, because there is an adoration. And if you think about Gnosticism, there was the idea of Sophia, and Sophia is like the feminine wisdom. And as a male, if I fall in love with a woman, let's say, I'm falling in love with that woman, but in some way also maybe Sophia is being channeled through this woman. And, that goes back a bit to like Crowley's idea of Babylon and the Scarlet Woman, where he's kind of channeling these energies through his mate, let's say. And I think they can also be reversed. Women can find holiness in their man. You see that maybe in the Emperor card of the tarot, where the woman wants that like stability and that hardness and that mental fortitude, the things that kind of have masculine energy. But the problem is the erotic, it's like a fine line between going holy and falling into lust, and maybe that's the problem. I don't know, like, you can have an erotic moment and you see it and you feel it, and maybe you're trying to get it into the holy, and it kind of just collapses into more base feelings or more base desires. But that, I think, that connects to the kind of madness of creation and destruction, because when you have erotic fixation or erotic love, you are wanting to kind of consume something. And in order to consume something, you kind of have to destroy it. But by doing that, you also create something new, either within yourself or within the other person or whatever. And it's kind of the eros thanatos connection, the sex and death urge, or the sex and death drive. But I think, all of these kinds of love, when you go through life and you have the different experiences with them, you kind of pick up different perspectives on them. As I've gotten older, I've really come to understand the cost of love. Like they say, love is never free, and that's absolutely true. Even if it's very fleeting love, there is a cost. You can have many different ways to pay that cost. There could be a betrayal. There could be some suffering or sorrow if there's like a death, or a splitting up of two people that are together. Geography can often pull people apart, their jobs. There's always a cost. There's a cost sexually, whether you're going to have a baby or, STDs or STIs or something. There's always a cost. I think love is always worth the cost. Now, if it's just lust, then it's not, because that's an empty urge, let's say, or an empty promise of something, and once it's gone, it's just gone. But if you have kind of a divine love, whether it's either erotic or familial or like a marriage, whatever, I think that you have to put some optimism in it and hope that everything's going to be okay, and that you will gain some kind of satisfaction, I guess. And now that can come in many forms. If you're in erotic love, you'd have sort of a higher state when you eventually meet into this erotic moment. If you have familial love, you have satisfaction of kind of rearing a child or helping a brother or a sister or something. If you're a teacher, helping your students can be satisfaction. But the problem is that all of these things often lead to suffering. I've said this before. You can check out my video on suffering if you want more in-depth ideas about it. But I think the hard part is to keep your optimism inside the suffering, and knowing that if you close yourself off to love, then you're just closing yourself off to the divine in all of its forms. So I think it's good to be open for it no matter how old you get, and I think it's good to hopefully recognize it when it comes and not let it pass you by. But that's about all I got for today. If you have anything you want to share about love or any of the other forms of love that I mentioned, you can do that in the comments. But otherwise, I will see you soon. Have a good day. Take care.